But as the fight wore on, it began to take a decided turn, and with it, the lives of these two fighters. Theirs was a rivalry born that night that would draw in two nations inching closer to war and take the measure of two men who had been fighting all their lives.
Joe Louise, tonight, this is your life. Now, to get all the answers, in your case, Joe, find out what makes a champ, let's go back to 1914, May 13th, your birthday. Where were you born, Joe?
In Lafayette, Alabama.
On a farm near Lafayette. 120 acres of poor land rented by your father and mother, Monroe and Lily Barrow. How many of you children were there, Joe?
8.
Of whom you were the 7th. Your sister Susie died some years ago,
yes.
And your brother Lonnie passed on just last June.
Yes, right.
But here from Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles are the others: Emerald, Albanius, De Leon, Eulalia, Eunice, and your stepbrother Pat.
In 1926, 12-year-old Joe Louise Barrow and his family decided to leave the South. Behind them were 120 acres of Alabama red clay soil and the privations of a sharecropper's life. Ahead lay Detroit and the promise of $5 a day at the Ford automobile factory. For thousands of Southern blacks like the Barrows, the job at Ford offered a living and a bit of dignity in their new world.
I recall that men would dress up on Sunday and they would wear their Ford badges on their lapel, on the vest,
and go to church.
And go to church with that Ford badge on.
Upward mobility, standard of living, pull us out.
Joe, too, went to work at Ford while still a teenager, pushing 200-pound truck bodies on a conveyor belt. In the summer, he hauled ice in the Negro section of Black Bottom. Soon, his lean physique was layered with muscle.
The first time I seen Joe, he worked on an ice wagon. They had to go up sometimes 3 flights of stairs with 75 pounds or 100 pounds of ice. And that was a big job, going up 3 flights of stairs with ice on your back.
Joe never had much use for school or anything else that required him to speak. He had battled a stammer since early childhood and learned the habit of silence. All his life, people would mistake this silence for dullness, and Joe never bothered correcting them.
Was there anything about Joe as a boy that showed he would someday be a great champion in the ring, De Leon?
I hardly think so. He could run faster than most boys. He was bigger than himself. But Joe was mostly quiet and stayed to himself.
Yes.
He was a little slow until he started boxing. And after he got to be champion, he still was slow.
Yeah.
He was...
Well, listen, guys, see, I didn't know it until later, but he went to the Brownston School.
Brownston School. That's
when that was for slow learners.
Yeah, for slow. That's where he met Thurston McKinney.
Did Thurston go there, too?
That's where Thurston went.
Thurston McKinney was a fast, light heavyweight and one of Joe's running buddies on the streets of Black Bottom. As legend has it, he was the one who introduced Joe to boxing. Joe's mother had given him $50 a week for violin lessons, hoping to keep him out of trouble. But Thurston had other ideas for the money.
Thurston McKinney told him, hey, you look like a sissy. We're going to play violin. Ain't nobody play no violin. So why don't you go up to the gym and learn how to box?
In the 75-pound division, Slugger Sullivan meets up with K.O. Nalfo in a one-round.
It was only natural that Joe Louise should find the boxing ring. 2 bits for a locker was all the kid needed. In the teeming ghettos of America's big cities, boxing became a flag of ethnic pride. Every neighborhood had a champion.
In the 20s, there were great Irish fighters, there were great Jewish fighters, there were great Italian fighters, particularly in New York and Chicago. There was these rivalries built on ethnic tension. And you could get 10,000 people for a fight between two neighborhood heroes.
Through much of the 20s, the heavyweight champion of the world was Jack Dempsey, a man held in higher regard by working-class Americans than the president or the Pope. Dempsey once drew 100,000 fans to a bout. It wasn't hard to figure. There was big money in the fight game.
As great as Babe Ruth was, who made $80,000 at the peak of his career in salary, Jack Dempsey, in his fight with Gene Tunney in 1926, made $750,000. That's more than the entire payroll of the Philadelphia Phillies baseball team, the St. Louis Browns baseball team. It was more than Babe Ruth made cumulatively in his entire career in one fight.
Boxing promised Louis not only a way to escape poverty, it was a way to reinvent himself, to leave behind the slow, stammering kid from the cotton fields and become the fast, fearsome fighter. He quit school for good, dropped a barrow from his name, and went simply by Joe Louise.
Madison Square Garden puts on a cauliflower show, and for a three-ring
Louis
circuit,
first made his mark in the 1934 Golden Gloves tournament, where he made it all the way to the finals. There were plenty of other good fighters around. Some worked harder, some moved better, but nobody could remember seeing a kid punch like this.
Punching power is something to a large extent that cannot be taught. It can be strengthened. You can make a fair puncher into a good puncher. A great puncher like Louis, they say, is born. It's the right coordination, the right build, everything coming together in a number of ways. And it is a sure ticket to the big money.
The scent of money is what brought around a small-time racketeer named John Roxborough. Roxborough was king of the illegal numbers lotteries in Detroit. But one glimpse at Joe in the ring, and he knew it was time for a different scheme.
Investment.
That's right.
Investment. Making
Right.
money.
Money.
That's what it was.
Money, honey.
That's what
Money,
it was,
honey.
money.
Roxborough partnered up with a wealthy and connected numbers man from Chicago named Julian Black.
And here he is, Joe, your good friend and co-manager with John Roxborough, Julian Black of Chicago.
Roxborough and Black could manage Joe's business affairs, but they knew they needed help
Come on
teaching
down
him
here,
how to
fellas. Tell
box.
us now, what was the next step, Julian?
Well, Ralph, our first big problem was to get the best trainer available we could find, so we were fortunate to get the late Jack Blackburn.
Blackburn, a convicted murderer with a notorious mean streak, had already trained several white world champions.
When Roxborough first called him in to take young Joe on, Blackburn's reaction was that he didn't want to waste his time. He said, a black heavyweight, what's the use? I'm just wasting my time because nobody will give a black heavyweight a chance. He was very bitter and totally cynical.
Blackburn's cynicism sprung in part from his own bitter experience. One of the most skilled lightweights who ever lived, his career had been undermined by boxing's color line. While lesser white fighters had become famous and rich, he had brawled in the back rooms of bars for the price of a few bottles of whiskey. In the end, Blackburn couldn't pass up the guaranteed $35 a week. And then, too, he thought he saw something special in Joe.
I think Blackburn really loved nobody, white or black or green or brown. I think he really loved Joe. He also saw the enormous possibility in him.
Blackburn would teach Joe the finer points of boxing, but perhaps more importantly, he warned him about what to expect as a black fighter. What you got to do every single time you get in the ring, he said, is to knock the other fella down. You got to let your right hand be your referee.
Liebling, mit dir beginnt der Frühling, es blühen alle Blumen im schönen Monat Mai. Liebling, mein Herz schlägt einen Salto bis in den 7.
The same year that a young Joe Louis first landed in Detroit, another future heavyweight, 20-year-old Max Schmelling, arrived in Berlin.
Unser Herzen macht es pup, pup, pup. Liebling, komm, spiel auf
Liberated from the tyranny of the Kaisers, Berlin in 1926 was a fantastic whirl of cabarets, theaters, and drinking spots.
Berlin war die Weltstadt, die einzige deutsche Weltstadt, Millionenstadt. Das hat ihn als einen Jungen, der ohne Geld nach Berlin kam, muss ihn das überwältigt haben, was ihm da angeboten wurde, an Vergnügungsmöglichkeiten, alles Mögliche.
The son of a working-class sailor, Schmelling had discovered boxing in small clubs in his hometown of Hamburg. Once in Berlin, his talent caught the eye of Germany's leading boxing writer, Arthur Bülow. Bülow agreed to pay his training fees and become his manager. With Bülow's patronage, Schmelling rose quickly, becoming first German, then European champion. His rise was followed avidly by Berlin's largely Jewish avant-garde, who had fallen in love with boxing.
It was new, it was different, it smacked of America, it was somewhat rebellious. It almost became a cult among the intellectuals, the cabaret society set in Weimar, Berlin. It was part of the decadence, it was part of the excitement.
Max took to the strange world of Weimar society as if he had been born to it. Within 2 years, the raw provincial boy was wearing tux and tails and attending all the best parties.
He knew all of the Berlin avant-garde. They wanted him to teach them how to box. They painted him, they sculpted him. He became a kind of fetish for them.
He goes on a self-improvement campaign. He starts reading books about and by his new circle of friends. He seemed to always be able to adapt. If I had a theme for Max's life, it would be that he's a survivor. He adapts to the situation, he adapts to the people he's dealing with.
By 1928, Max Schmelling had achieved everything he could in European boxing. He and his manager, Arthur Bülow, set sail for New York and a shot at boxing's biggest prize, the heavyweight championship of the world. Since the late 19th century, the heavyweight championship had been largely the property of America, and within America, of the white race. There had only been one black heavyweight champion before, and many white Americans vowed that he'd be the last. His name was Jack Johnson.
There was a term at the time that was used as a bad nigger. Bad nigger is the threatening. And one who lusts for white women. And this was the baddest of them all.
Johnson cut a broad swath through the consciousness of America with his fists and his mouth. As he brawled his way to the World Championship in 1908, Johnson became notorious for taunting and humiliating his white opponents. But he was even more provocative outside the ring, consorting openly with white women.
He desegregated more whorehouses than anybody in history. He was a wild man. There's a famous story that he's driving through Georgia, and the sheriff stops him and says, "You're driving 80 miles an hour and you're fined $50. And Jack Johnson hands the sheriff a $100 bill and says, "I'm coming back the same way."
Jack Johnson had to be the bravest man in America. I'm amazed at what he did publicly that many would not dare to do privately. In fact, even looking at a white woman could be a death sentence at the time.
Fight promoters began to look high and low for a great white hope who could end Jack Johnson's reign. When none was found, federal prosecutors stepped in with a trumped-up morals charge. But it would be other black fighters who would pay the steepest price for the bigotry Johnson stirred. For the next decade, while Jack Dempsey ruled the ring, his best competition watched from outside the ropes.
Joe, I'm satisfied you're going to be the next heavyweight champion of the world. I hope so. Well, Joe, as your manager, I'm going to do everything possible to get you a chance to fight for the championship. Thank you.
John Roxborough refused to be discouraged by boxing's color line. 2 decades after Jack Johnson had been forced from the ring, He believed it was time for another black heavyweight champion, and he thought he had the fighter to do it.
The person who was going to get the shot at the heavyweight title had to be a special individual. Not only a great boxer, but this person had to be more. This person had to be non-threatening to white society, to white dominance, to white values.
Roxborough and Black set down a series of rules for the young fighter, which they shared freely with reporters.
He could not gloat over opponents. He could not be seen in public with white women. He had to be seen as a Bible-reading, mother-loving, God-fearing individual, and not to be too black.
The shadow of Jack Johnson was hanging over everything that Roxborough and Black did. They set out deliberately to create somebody who was precisely the opposite of Jack Johnson.
Joe had already seen what happened to impudent blacks in his own lifetime, so he willingly donned the mask of the good Negro.
Nobody knew how deeply Joe really felt. Because remember, Black and Roxborough had schooled him to suppress his emotions. So he never really showed them.
The mask was not just for the outside world, it was also for Joe, a way to shield himself from revealing too much of what was inside. He says less than any sports figure in history, observed one writer, and that includes Dummy Taylor, the mute pitcher for the Giants. Only in the ring could Joe really let himself go, and he did so with a fury that thrilled and terrified. By the middle of 1935, Louis had won his first 23 professional bouts, an average of one every 2 weeks, and was beginning to earn glowing notices. But he hadn't fought east of Detroit yet. The road to the big prize, the heavyweight championship, stretched ahead 1,000 miles to New York. Seven years earlier, in 1928, Max Schmelling had arrived in New York with his own roadmap to the heavyweight crown. But New York hardly took notice.
In the 1920s, foreign fighters were not treated well in New York City. One could be a national champion of Germany or France or Italy or any other country. You were still treated like a six-round fighter in New York.
In typical fashion, Schmelling adapted to his new surroundings. He abruptly fired his mentor Arthur Bulow and hired in his place a wily New Yorker named Joe Jacobs, known widely as Yussel the Muscle.
This was the quintessential boxing manager of the 20s and 30s. Cigar-smoking, fedora-wearing guy, had the boutonniere on his lapel, would go in and talk a mile a minute. He was the guy who could open doors. He was the guy who would give him the publicity. He was the guy who had the contacts. That's the biggest thing in boxing. He had contacts.
Hello, everybody. Greetings from my training camp, Green K Lodge, Kingston, New York.
The two made an unlikely pair, the square-jawed Teuton and the wiry, wisecracking Jew.
Max Schmelling is now quartered in the finest training camp ever assembled.
But the partnership
His home,
worked.
There
was a saying that Joe Jacobs couldn't see the difference between a left hook and a right cross, but he knew how to sell. That's why Joe Jacobs, who wasn't very much liked, was the right man.
Well, Jack, we certainly do look like brothers.
Well, we certainly do, Max.
It didn't hurt that Schmelling was a dead ringer for Jack Dempsey.
If you can fight as
Soon,
well as you look,
Jacobs was
this
placing
fight, you'll
flattering
certainly come out the
profiles in the
victor.
sports pages
Anyway, whoever
and
wins the
getting
fight, I know will be
fights.
the best man.
In 1930, after only 2 years in America, Schmelling landed a bout with Jack Sharkey for the vacant heavyweight championship. 80,000 fans filled the Yankee Stadium in a fight billed as a battle between the continents. Sharkey came out swinging and was outpointing Schmelling on all the judges' cards. But in the fourth round, he made a fatal mistake. Corralled against the ropes, he slugged Schmelling below the belt.
Schmelling clutched himself and fell onto the canvas and started to get up. And it was at that point that Joe Jacobs sprung into action and stood up and started shouting, "Don't get up, don't get up, you were fouled, you were fouled." He starts running around the ring, he starts running to the ref, he starts pleading Schmelling's case. There's this moment of great indecision and tumult in the ring and outside the ring. And finally, Schmelling was declared the victor.
Schmelling returned to Germany with a heavyweight title, but little honor.
He's called the low blow champion. He becomes the punchline of jokes. He becomes an object of disdain for many cabaret routines.
The Germany Max returned to was a far darker place than the one he had left. The economy was collapsing under an avalanche of worthless marks. Unemployment was rising, and with it, violence in the streets. Once on the fringes, the Nazi Party was drawing strength from chaos. Suddenly, the implacable glare of the party's leader could be seen everywhere. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler assumed sole power over Germany and immediately began a quiet campaign of terror. Many of Schmelling's old friends, Jews, homosexuals, communists, who had found a home in the Weimar cabarets, suddenly found themselves outcasts and fled or were banished from the new Germany.
May 10th, after the takeover, there was a book burning. And a lot of those books were by these artists that had been very close to Max Schmelling. So all of these people were in trouble once the political winds had shifted.
But Max had already tacked again and set himself with the prevailing winds. In 1932, he had married the Czech-born movie star Annie Ondra. Blonde and beautiful, she was the picture of an Aryan princess and a favorite of Hitler's inner circle. Max and Annie became Germany's most glamorous couple, even appearing together in a popular movie.
Ich möchte Ihnen ja so gerne helfen.
Helfen?
The same year, Schmelling fought a rematch against American Jack Sharkey. This time, he lost his title in a widely condemned split decision.
He got redemption in the only way that he could. He was seen to be a victim of a political decision in a way. And so when he came back to Germany, all of a sudden he was a hero.
The people really seemed to like him. The way he had the looks, you know. There's an old Jewish saying, you have to have a ponem as well. You know, you have to say a ponem, and Schmelling had that certain look that which attracted the people.
Max's fame brought him freedom to pursue his career in America, great wealth, and access to the highest echelons. At first, Schmelling had no particular fondness for Hitler. In fact, he and Annie laughed over the Führer's resemblance to Charlie Chaplin. But Max did admire power and understood its usefulness.
Wenn jemand helfen wollte oder er hat sich dann immer direkt an Hitler oder an Mitarbeiter von Hitler gewandt. Schmelling hat dort gerne verkehrt, aber das ist nicht unbedingt eine Liebe zu den Nazis, sondern es ist eine Liebe zu den Mächtigen, zu denen, die im Licht stehen. Schmelling wollte gerne im Mittelpunkt stehen.
Schmelling tried to ingratiate himself on two continents. He courted American fight fans, visiting New York often with Joe Jacobs conspicuously by his side. But he was also willing to carry out the bidding of the Nazi regime. As he prepared to return to New York in June 1933, Hitler summoned him for a meeting.
And toward the end, Hitler says two things. If you run into problems, feel free to contact me if I can be of any help. The second thing he says is, when you go to the United States, you're going to obviously be interviewed by people who are thinking that very bad things are going on in Germany at this moment. And I hope you'll be able to tell them that the situation isn't as bleak as they think it is. And that basically was the contract. under which the two of them would operate from that point on. It certainly was a devil's contract.
Only days after their meeting, Hitler purged German boxing of Jews. He ordered a national boycott of Jewish stores. Many businesses were ransacked and destroyed, and Jews paraded in the streets. Nevertheless, upon his return to New York, Schmelling upheld his end of the bargain.
Und Schmeling ist dann in die USA gekommen und hat eine Pressekonferenz gegeben. Es waren sehr viele Journalisten, die ihn erwartet haben und die sehr interessiert waren, also was denn nun in Deutschland los ist. Und Schmeling hat also diesen Journalisten erzählt, dass in Deutschland ist alles ruhig, ist alles in Ordnung, es gibt keine Judenverfolgung, alles ist okay. Und das war sein Auftrag, die Menschen in den Amerika zu beruhigen.
But Schmelling's efforts to please both his government and his American public could at times tangle himself and his manager in knots. In 1935, he fought a comeback bout against the American Steve Hamas in his hometown of Hamburg.
Bei dieser Veranstaltung muss es zugegangen sein wie bei einem Reichsparteitag. Also es gab SA-Kapellen, die gespielt haben, es gab Reden, die gehalten wurden, es gab unendliche Sieg, Heil und Heil Hitler-Rufe und dann noch ein Sieg von Schmeling über einen Amerikaner.
After Schmelling knocked out Hamas, he and 29,000 fans spontaneously stood and sang the Nazi anthem with arms raised in the Sieg Heil.
It was sort of a moment of high Wagnerian pageantry. And in the middle of it all, Joe Jacobs climbed into the ring and also gave the Nazis salute. It made the Nazis unhappy because here was this Jew giving the Nazis salute, and not only that, but he had a cigar in his hand, which they thought was a terrible impertinence.
Jacobs' reception in America was no warmer when a photograph of the salute appeared in newspapers the next day.
Up in the Bronx, the good burghers agreed that the little man with the big cigar was no credit to their creed. In the Broadway delicatessens and nighteries where Playboy Jacobs is a familiar figure, the waiters were conspiring to slip Mickey fins in his herring. Jack Miley, New York Daily News.
While Max Schmelling rode out the vicissitudes of an up-and-down career, Joe Louise was heading in one direction only, straight up. By 1935, Louise had raced through the lower ranks of professional boxing. Next stop, the big time, New York.
In the 1930s, New York was the capital of boxing, the Mecca. There were no casinos. There was no Las Vegas. There was no Atlantic City. Big fights happened at 50th Street and 8th Avenue in the old Madison Square Garden.
New York boxing was controlled by one company, the giant Madison Square Garden Corporation. The Garden promoted the fights and owned the fighters, and they wanted nothing to do with a black heavyweight.
Jimmy Johnson was running boxing in Madison Square Garden, and he had a phone call from John Roxborough out in Detroit. And John Roxborough offered him Joe Louise. And Jimmy Johnson didn't know that John Roxborough was a black man. And Jimmy Johnson said, "We don't need the nigger." So that's how Madison Square Garden lost Joe Louise.
There was one fight promoter willing to take a chance on Joe, Mike Jacobs, otherwise known as Uncle Mike. Jacobs, no relation to Schmelling's manager, owned a thick New York brogue and a set of poorly molded false teeth, through which he'd mutter his signature line, "What's in it for Uncle Mike?"
He was a street kid. He sold newspapers at first. He would go to the box office and buy tickets for the scalpers until he began to realize that, heck, he could do this for himself.
Uncle Mike could turn anything to his advantage, even the Depression, which finally gave him his chance to go after the Madison Square Garden's monopoly on boxing. For years, the Garden had donated generously to the Milk Fund for Babies, the favorite charity of Mrs. William Randolph Hearst, wife of the newspaper tycoon. In gratitude, Hearst's stable of big-time sports writers spilled gallons of ink promoting the Garden's fights. But with boxing in the doldrums thanks to the Depression, the Garden had cut back on Mrs. Hearst's charity. Uncle Mike stepped in.
He made a deal with them to promote his own shows with a bigger portion going towards the Milk Fund charity. And in doing so, he became very chummy with some of the major newspaper reporters and columnists for the Hearst newspapers. This was a masterstroke.
Jacobs convinced 3 of Hearst's biggest sports writers to join him in a new venture, the 20th Century Sporting Club. With the backing of the Hearst papers, 20th Century began to compete with the Garden for the biggest boxing promotions, drawing thousands to the cavernous New York Hippodrome.
Mike Jacobs has the venues, he has the press behind him, but he needs a big draw. And he sees something special in Joe Louise.
What Mike Jacobs saw was not Lewis's skin color, but his already strong hold on Black Americans, whose money was as green as anyone else's.
There were these stories working their way back east about this mythical boxer who was going to be the Moses of boxing. So you have this incredible scene where Joe Louise comes to New York for the first time in May of 1935, and the bellhops carry him off the train. They all knew who he was, and they were waiting for him to get there.
With an evangelical following of black fight fans, Mike Jacobs rushed to set up a coming-out party for his heralded young phenom.
What they needed was a name opponent and a sacrificial lamb to show Louise at his best.
Jacobs settled on an ex-heavyweight champion, the Italian giant Primo Carnera, otherwise known as the Ambling Alp.
Carnera was between 6'5" and 6'6". He weighed generally between 260 and 280 pounds. There were people, sports writers included, who claimed there should be a special dreadnought class for men like Carnera.
In fact, Carnera was hardly a fighter at all. For years, he'd been managed by New York gangsters and had won a series of fixed fights, including, it was rumored, the World Championship in 1933. Over time, Carnera had learned some rudimentary skills in the ring, but what was most important to Mike Jacobs was that the paying public loved him. The Louise-Carnera fight was the most anticipated to hit New York in a decade. Mike Jacobs' publicity agents had cleverly linked the fight to a brewing international crisis. Italy, symbolized by the giant Carnera, was preparing to invade the kingdom of Ethiopia, embodied by the relatively diminutive Louise.
Regardless of race, creed, or color, may the better men emerge victorious.
In the end, the Man Mountain turned out to be more like a molehill. Louise knocked him out in the 6th round. Primo came down slowly, one reporter wrote, like a great chimney that had been dynamited. After the fight, more than 20,000 people showed up at the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem, where Louise had promised to appear, win, lose, or draw. When the fighter finally showed, he wore his usual blank expression, as if the crowd were looking at someone else, one writer remarked. It was all too big and too much for just a kid, Louise would later say. But in fact, it was only just beginning. Overnight, Louise had become the biggest draw in the fight game. Over the next year, Jacobs easily set up opponents for Joe, and Joe just as easily knocked them down.
Louise was going through the heavyweight division like Sherman through Georgia. Kingfish Levinsky, 1 round. Max Bayer, 4 rounds. Primo Carnera, 6 rounds. Stanley Parita, 1 round. Lee Ramage, 3 rounds. Nobody can do anything against this young man. He has the big punch, he has the power, he has the style. He is capturing the popular imagination.
With each victory, Joe's stature in Black America rose higher.
We invested so much in Joe Louis when he started winning. We needed some victories. The fact that Joe Louis was winning without any dispute over white America. He was our nonviolent, violent way of expressing ourselves.
We had never had guys to look up to when he first started. We didn't have nobody. He comes on, and we had somebody to look up to.
Ravaged by the Depression and virulent racism, many blacks invested Joe with the strength they lacked. In North Carolina, an inmate bound for the electric chair was said to have cried, "Save me, Joe Louis, save me."
Joe Louis's victories over white opponents were palpable and tangible, and blacks saw in them something that fed them.
Joe tried to live up to people's expectations, but the adulation of the outside world was making it harder to play the good Negro. He was making serious money now, money he could never have dreamed of back in Detroit. And there were women, too. They couldn't keep their hands off him.
He had a beautiful body, and there was no fat on him. He was big and muscular and a beautiful color, kind of coffee color with cream, double cream. He was just a beautiful man.
Louis had become so big, so fast, that he no longer had time for his manager's sermons.
I happened to be in different cities when he would come through, and there was always a woman in that city, although I don't know names, but I would see girls. Sometimes it would be a chorus girl or a singer from a show. He scored.
Trying to keep the mask from slipping, Joe's handlers encouraged him to marry a beautiful young secretary named Marva Trotter. The couple walked the streets of Harlem like movie stars. But nuptials did little to slow Joe down.
I heard that Roxburgh picked that girl from him for Joe.
They did. They picked her. He was getting into things. And they decided that he should marry somebody.
Yeah.
She was attractive.
Yeah.
She was intelligent. And he said, well, I'll just go along with the program.
Yeah.
But whenever he's in town, we slip off to Toledo at night, slip away from Marva. And I don't know, it was just one of those things.
Young man.
Looked like it was just a business deal. You got to marry to keep you out of trouble.
Unlike Jack Johnson before him, Joe never flaunted his personal life, and sports writers kept his secrets. But that didn't mean they treated him well. In the end, the mask could only offer Joe so much protection from white racism.
America was a different country in 1934 and 1936. And if you go back and read the sports writing of the 30s, there are despicable, repugnant stereotypes of Louis as dumb, as lazy on one hand, or as an animal of the jungle on the other hand.
I felt myself strongly ridden by the impression that here was a truly savage person, a man on whom civilization rested no more securely than a shawl thrown over one's shoulders. I had the feeling that I was in the room with a wild animal. Paul Gallico, New York Daily News.
Louis was picking up a growing number of white fans. Laid low by the Depression themselves, they responded to his rags to riches story. But there were still millions who wished to see Joe stopped in his tracks. Good Negro or not, he was still a black man physically dominating his white opponents. And so many hankered for the return of a great white hope. But few imagined that the savior might come in the form of an aging fighter from across the Atlantic.
Und seinem Herausforderer Max Schmelling statt.
By 1936, Max Schmelling's up-and-down career was on an upswing. He'd won 4 fights in a row in Europe and scrapped his way back into contention in the heavyweight division. Despite his age, he had become the next logical opponent for Joe Louise. The fight would be crucial. The winner to get a shot at the world champion, Jimmy Braddock, a former longshoreman with brittle hands who would come to be known as the Cinderella Man.
When Louise fought Schmelling, the idea was that either one of them could beat Braddock, and therefore what mattered was who would have the privilege of fighting Braddock first. This was really the fight for the world championship.
No one gave Max much of a chance. The boxing press scoffed, calling him Moxie Schmelling for daring even to take the fight. But Schmelling would not yield to doubt. He believed he had one decisive advantage over his opponent.
I think that he thought that he could outthink him, that his brain was better than that of Joe.
Schmelling began to study Louis's fights, looking for something, anything he could use to his advantage.
I think that with the Germanic thoroughness that Schmelling had, looked at every available footage film on Louis, he not only ran it forward, he would stop it. He would actually run it backward. He would put it in slow motion.
After weeks of study, Schmelling believed the film had yielded something, a small defect in Louis's overwhelming attack.
When Joe Louise jabbed, and he had the greatest jab in the history of boxing up to that time. He would jab, but the jab would come down to his waist rather than up to his face.
And that was the split second where Schmelling could land his right hand. He believed in that.
Max, have you discovered any particular weakness in the brown bomber?
Yes, I did, but I won't tell.
Schmelling left Germany for New York with little fanfare. Unlike Max himself, the Nazis had no confidence that he could win. On the orders of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, Nazi newspapers had buried the story of the fight.
Hitler was annoyed that he was going to fight a Negro. Schmelling was a Jewish manager and fighting a Negro, a nigger. No, and I don't think they expected him to have a chance.
At his Lakewood camp, Louis seemed overconfident, and the only person who could have whipped him into shape was in no shape himself.
At that point, Jack Blackburn's problems had affected him. Jack was drinking. His camp was confused, and his mind was diverted.
But Schmelling was focused, more focused than ever before. He was not only working on his body, but on his mind. He knew that to land his right hand, he would have to be in close, and that meant overcoming his fear.
Max thought that part of his strategy would have to be showing no fear. During the weigh-in, he walks up to Joe Louise, shakes his hand, says, "Hello, Joe, how do you do?" He comes away and shouts over his shoulder, "Good luck this evening, Joe." Joe Louise and the press are perplexed by this show of courteous bravado.
And in about 5 seconds, the fight will be on. They're twisting in the corners. There's the bell, and they step out, sparring around in the center of the ring there. Neither man.
Both fighters came out cautiously, feeling each other out.
Just lashed out with the left. Neither man has got a blow. There's the light exchange of left, both feinting and bluffing. Neither man got a real blow. Once more, in the center of the ring, Louis in the very center, Schmelling back, and Schmelling led with a fast left.
He would probe with it, and he'd move, and he'd be looking for openings.
Every time Louis jabbed, he'd return his left hand low at his side rather than up here where it's supposed to be,
where he could block a counter right hand.
At just over 2 minutes into the fourth round, Louis jabbed and Schmelling pounced.
Schmelling backing away cautiously, waiting for some opening that he wants. Schmelling over a right hand high on Lewis's jaw that made Louis rock his head. Schmelling has sent Louis down. Joe Louis is down.
You saw Joe Louis's hand drop. And when that hand dropped, he came over with that right cross. Boxing is a very unique sport. You can have all the great assets like Joe Louis had: speed, great boxing ability, great footwork, great left jab, tremendous power in your punches. But if you're hit on the chin, all those assets go right down the drain.
At that moment, Schmelling would later say, Louis changed from an indestructible force to a hurt and bewildered boy.
He was out of it. He wasn't himself for the rest of the fight. He was fighting on heart and instinct alone. After that, it wasn't Joe Louis anymore. He was just a punching bag.
For round after round, Schmelling continued to batter Louis with his right hand. Midway through, Joe's mother, Lily, had to be led from the stadium screaming, "My God, don't let him kill my child."
And there was a pop, pop, every time one of those right hands landed. It sounded like a bag full of water coming down from the second floor of a building. Pop, pop, pop.
You just can't get hit by right hands by a heavyweight repeatedly. I don't care who you are. You get hit enough right hands, you're going. And Schmelling could punch. And Schmelling was a good boxer. And Joe was slow and overconfident and believed nobody could beat him. And he found out different.
Schmelling got over two more hard rights to Louis's
Finally, in the 12th round, the punishment became too much.
Straightened up Louis with hard rights and left to the jaw. He has puffed up Louis's left cheek, and Louis is down. Louis is down, hanging to the rope, hanging badly. He is a very tired fighter. He is blinking his eyes, shaking his head. The count is done. The fight is over. The fight is over. And Schmelling is the winner. Louis is completely out. They've had to lift him.
You talk about after the fight now. There were throngs of people coming down the middle of the street. Everybody was just as quiet, and all you could hear was, "Oh, Louis was dope. I think he was dope."
Everybody was sick. And usually, after Joe Louis got through fighting, everybody would be out in the streets, driving, honking their horns and doing these, and not only in Detroit, Philadelphia, New York, and Chicago, everywhere. Not that night, no, it was a sad night. Just like a funeral it was. Nobody came out, no horns honking, no nothing.
I was sitting in my husband's lap, and he was losing the fight. I was crying because he was losing the fight. If I think about it hard enough, I'll cry again.
I just can't help thinking of the bitter disappointment, the shattered hopes, the tears and the heartaches that fell upon an entire race just before 11 o'clock last night. An idol fell, and the crashing was so complete, so dreadful, and so totally unexpected that it broke the hearts of the Negroes of the world. The New York Post.
As fast as Louis had been built up, he was now torn down.
The press denunciations were vehement, brutal, that he was a fabrication, that this was all a kind of buildup of a nobody.
This brown god had crumbled before our eyes, and his substance was dross and alloy and clay. Louis, the flawless fighter, was a myth, a delusion and a legend that never happened. Davis Walsh, Hearst Newspapers.
Louis himself immediately left New York for the solace of his hometown. Even there, he hid out, too ashamed to show his face.
Joe come on the playground about a week after his head was swollen up, on dark glasses. He didn't get out of the car. He just sat in the car, but his head was still swollen up.
When he finally did go on the streets, kids being who they were, would run up to him and say, Max Schmelling, Max Schmelling. And I think it got to him because was he still their hero? Was he still the great Black Hope?
Max Schmelling could finally return to Germany to a hero's welcome. Upon landing in Frankfurt, he was greeted by thousands of his countrymen lining the roadway for miles. Always attentive to the public mood, the Nazis turned their cool handshake into a warm embrace. Joseph Goebbels, who had tried to bury the fight in the German press, now ordered lavish coverage of Schmelling's victory, including a photograph of himself listening to the fight with Max's wife, Annie.
Stayed up all night. At 3 a.m., the fight begins. In round 12, Schmelling knocks out the Negro. Wonderful. The white man defeats the black man, and the white man was a German, Joseph Goebbels.
Within days of his return, Max was invited to dine with Hitler.
Hitler spürte die große Begeisterung der Massen für Schmeling und vor allen Dingen war er elektrisiert, als er diesen Boxkampf sah. Und er ordnete sofort an, dass dieser Film in Deutschland vor jedem Spielfilm einmal gezeigt werden sollte. Und dieser Film lief er dann unter dem Titel, den Goebbels erfunden hat, Max Schmelings Sieg, ein deutscher Sieg.
Jetzt steht Joe Louise auf matten Knien im Ring, verteidigt sich noch, aber er hat keine richtige Kraft mehr. Aus dem gefürchteten braunen Bomber ist ein armer, zerschlagener kleiner Negerboy geworden.
Und das ließ so richtig alles wieder aufleben. Nicht? Wir waren wieder so richtig in Ekstase und haben uns unwahrscheinlich gefreut. Ich kann mich erinnern, dass im Kino unwahrscheinlich geklatscht worden ist.
The public acclaim was intoxicating. This is what Schmelling had always wanted. The adulation of a grateful nation. But the cheers also made it easier for Max to turn away from what was happening in his country. For a while, perhaps, it had been possible to focus on progress, new jobs, and new optimism. But by 1935, no one could miss the giant rallies exalting the master race, new laws evicting Jews from the professions and civil service, and the arrests, beatings, and executions of political enemies, including many of Max's old circle.
Schmelling writes about how he would go to his favorite clubs and every week there'd be somebody new who was gone. But he just looked the other way. He just didn't think about the larger questions.
Occasionally, Schmelling tried to put in a word for his Jewish acquaintances. If he could do that, he reasoned, what was wrong with meeting with Hitler? How could he, a mere sportsman, stand in the way of the Nazi juggernaut?
Es gab doch sehr viele deutsche Persönlichkeiten, die eigentlich gedanklich mit diesem Regime überhaupt nicht übereinstimmten. Und trotzdem haben sie also mit diesen Nazi-Größen zusammen Tee getrunken oder Kaffee getrunken oder sind zu Empfängen gegangen. Warum? Weil einfach ihr Leben wichtiger war. Denn jeder, der sich da entgegenstellte, der musste damit rechnen, dass damals die Gestapo kam und sie abgeholt hat.
But Schmelling was not like other Germans.
Schmeling war reich, er war berühmt, er sprach gut Englisch, er hatte gute Freunde in Amerika und in anderen Ländern. Er hätte überall hingehen können und wäre überall willkommen gewesen als dieser berühmte Mann.
Other prominent Germans had chosen to emigrate rather than live under the Nazis. Actress Marlene Dietrich, author Thomas Mann, film director Fritz Lang, among others, helped to open the eyes of the world to what was going on inside the Nazi state. But Schmelling remained silent, preferring the hero's life in Germany to an uncertain fate outside it.
War loyal auch gegenüber seiner Regierung, aber diese Loyalität hat auch einen großen Preis erfordert. Er hat sein Gewissen belasten müssen, denn er musste die ganzen Schattenseiten des Regimes, die sich ja so deutlich gezeigt haben, in der Zwangsherrschaft, in den Lagern, in den Verfolgungen, in der Diskriminierung, all das hat er als Preis in Kauf genommen für sein eigenes Geschäft und für seinen eigenen Ruhm.
In later years, Schmelling would make much of the fact that he never became a member of the Nazi Party. But in fact, the Nazis had no interest in recruiting him. At one point, a friend of Schmelling's wrote to the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, asking if Schmelling should become a party member.
Und es gibt ein Antwortschreiben des Adjutanten von Himmler, dass der Reichsführer festgelegt hat, dass Schmeling dem deutschen Volk mehr nützen kann, wenn er weder der NSDAP noch der SS oder SA oder anderen Organisationen angehört. Es war sehr pragmatisch.
Schmeling was most useful as somebody who was apolitical. He was very useful as being apolitical because he then would be believable. And if he were to come to the United States and to start to give the party message, that would be the end of the use of Max Schmeling for Adolf Hitler.
In the summer of 1936, Hitler came to collect on his bargain with Schmeling. The Olympic Games were about to open in Berlin, and Hitler had big plans for them. If all went well, they would become the proving ground for his notions of Aryan superiority and German national resurgence. But the U.S. Olympic Committee was threatening to spoil the party by boycotting the Games. Hitler looked to Germany's best-known international athlete for help.
They asked that Schmeling contact the committee to urge them to understand that there would be no difficulties politically for Jews or for blacks if they participated in the Games.
Quietly, Schmeling met with members of the U.S. Olympic Committee at the Commodore Hotel in New York. Committee members produced clippings of dark tidings in Germany. Schmeling assured them that the reports were false, that Hitler could be trusted. Days later, by a narrow vote, the USOC agreed that America would attend the Games. By the summer of 1936, Schmeling could no longer pretend to be living in two worlds. Through small expediencies, he had become a servant of the Nazi government.
Der Prozesscharakter muss man vielleicht noch betonen. Den Prozesscharakter, dass man am Anfang sich als naiver Sportler geschmeichelt fühlt, dann wird man benutzt. Aber das passiert ja nicht innerhalb von einer Woche, das passiert ja schleichend, innerhalb von mehrerer Jahre. Und da entwickelt sich dann so eine gegenseitige Verstrickung.
Der erfolgreichste Teilnehmer ist Jesse Owens, ein Farbiger.
In the end, Hitler's Olympic dream was marred by a sprinter and long jumper from the United States named Jesse Owens.
We're very glad to come out on top. Thank you very kindly.
Owens' 4 gold medals were a salve to Black America in the wake of Joe Louis's defeat 2 months earlier. Here was the vindication so many had waited for. Joe was happy for his friend, but Owens' success only deepened the shame of his own defeat. As if to erase the memory, he fought furiously, winning a string of 7 bouts in 8 months. All he wanted was a rematch with the German. But Schmeling had other plans. As a reward for having beaten Louis, he inked a contract to fight world champion Jimmy Braddock, the Cinderella Man. The prospect of a Schmeling-Braddock bout panicked the Louis camp.
Mike Jacobs thought that if Schmeling won the championship, he would go back to Germany and Hitler would actually take over the title and use it for his own purposes.
Mike Jacobs went to work, spreading rumors that the fight would be widely boycotted by Jewish fans. Braddock wouldn't earn a dime. But if Braddock agreed to fight Louis instead, Jacobs promised he'd never have to work again.
He started offering more money, more money, more money. So finally he came up with a deal, said, I'll give you not only the biggest guarantee, but you will have 10% of the profits of Joe Louis's fights for the next 10 years.
This was an offer Braddock couldn't afford to pass up. He dropped his plans to fight Schmeling and signed on to face Louis in June 1937 in Chicago. For the first time in more than 2 decades, a black man would fight for the heavyweight title. More than 60,000 fans converged on Chicago's Comiskey Park to watch it.
Here they come. Joe jumping out as usual. Jim Braddock stepped out fast, and he let go with a hard right hand.
In the first round, Braddock knocked Louis down. For an instant, it looked like a repeat of the Schmeling fight. But Louis quickly recovered, and in the 8th round, knocked Braddock senseless. The Cinderella Man had to be carried to his dressing room.
8, 9, 10, a new world champion. And new champion of the world, Joe Louis.
Louis had scaled the summit of the boxing world, becoming the first black man since Jack Johnson to attain the heavyweight championship. But to Joe, the championship tasted sour.
Even in a moment of triumph, knocking out Jim Braddock, when people were congratulating Joe, "You're champ," Joe said, "No, I'm not the champ. I'm not the champion. I won't be the champion until I lick Schmeling."
Max Schmelling was furious over the way the World Championship had been snatched from him. He complained bitterly to the New York Athletic Commission, to no avail.
I think I got a runaround. I traveled 25,000 miles to face Jimmy Braddock for the title.
Now Schmeling was as hungry for the rematch as Louis. Terms for the fight were quickly agreed upon, and the date was set for June 1938 in Yankee Stadium. From the start, the match was seen as much more than boxing, much more than sports. It was going to pit whole nations, whole ideologies against each other.
This was 1938. Hitler's intentions were clear by then. Hitler's hatred of Jews was clear. Hitler's militarism and expansionism were clear. And Schmeling is probably unfairly seen as an extension of Hitler. He is seen as a Nazi.
Just 3 months before the fight, Hitler's army rolled into Austria without firing a shot. The so-called Anschluss helped to cement Americans' hatred of everything German. When Schmeling arrived in New York by steamer in May, he was met at the dock by hundreds of protesters and mocking chants of Heil Hitler. Many Americans channeled their antipathy for Max into affection for Joe. Confronted with the choice between a white Nazi and a black American, all but the most hardened racists backed Louis. Even President Roosevelt enlisted Louis in the war of propaganda against Nazism. Squeezing Joe's arm, he said, "These are the muscles we need to defeat the Germans." But Joe had little use for the hypocrisy of geopolitics.
I think Joe Louis understood that while he was being held up as the symbol of democracy, black people couldn't vote, black people did not have equal rights. The army was segregated.
For Joe, the motivation was simpler. Quoted in one New York newspaper, he said, "I am out for revenge. All I ask of Schmeling is that he stand up and fight without quitting."
People think that I'm going to the ring gun shy. Why should I go into the ring gun shy when Schmelling is 2 years older and I'm 2 years smarter in boxing?
By the day of the fight, bookies had set the line at 2-1 in Lewis's favor, but doubts lingered. Could Joe handle the pressure? Had he found a defense for Schmelling's right hand? Most expected a long, punishing fight. The evening of June 22nd was hot and sticky. More than 90,000 fans, white and black, streamed into Yankee Stadium, one of the largest crowds ever to pass through the turnstiles.
It is a sea of humanity. It is something out of a tremendous political event. There is a rush, there's an excitement, which it is almost impossible to describe today.
The huge crowd, the shifting, ever-changing scenes, winking pinpoints of light from 50,000 cigars and cigarettes, for all the world like fireflies in the blue-black night, reaching back until the last rows are lost in blank obscurity. The crowd makes you catch your breath.
So now it is June 22nd, 1938.
In a nation of 130 million, some 70 million would tune in to the fight on the radio that night, the biggest audience ever for a single program.
The country was immobilized when this fight was on. Dances were interrupted to broadcast the fight, wrestling matches, movies. In movie theaters, the movie was stopped in the middle and the fight was broadcast over the loudspeaker.
I remember walking down the street and people were sitting on their front porches and they had their little radios ready. And it was real quiet, as though there was just something out here saying, we are about to experience an indescribable event in our lives.
Everybody stopped. They went to whoever had a radio. And you listen, there wasn't anybody that was in street traffic. I think even the streetcar stopped. Everybody stopped and listened to the fight. It was like that moment.
Gegen diese vorgefasste Meinung von Millionen.
It was 3 a.m. in Germany when Nazi broadcaster Arno Helmes finally took the microphone.
Wir sind ja um 2:30 geweckt worden und kamen dann neugierig in den Kantinenraum, wo ein großer Lautsprecher stand. Und wir waren alle Sportbegeisterte natürlich. Die anderen, die haben weitergeschlafen. Dann hat nach einiger Zeit das Radio eingesetzt. Und da hieß es dann plötzlich, hier ist das Yankee Stadium New York. Und dann waren Störungen. Das ging ja damals über Telefon, die Übertragung. Und das Yankee Stadium ist mit 70.000 Zuschauern ausverkauft. Der Lärm ist unüberhörbar. Und dann wieder.
In Austria, the young Jewish boy Fritz Mandelbaum stayed up late to listen with his father.
The fight was ballyhooed in Germany, as well as the fight of the century. There was the Negro, an inferior race, and the man, Joe Louise, who represented the Negro, all brawn and animal brutality versus German noble strength. It is amazing to me in retrospect how much the Nazis really gambled on a victory. The gamble was, if you hype it that much, what if you lose?
Schmelling made his way to the ring under a bombardment of banana peels, cigarette packs, and spit.
He was pallid. There was something about it. You could smell it, you know. And, you know, it's scary. You can get killed here, as they say. The roar that began was just an unimaginable, constant roar. You couldn't hear the subway coming out, and nothing. The roar up into that Bronx night. If you had any imagination, you felt the whole country watching.
Joe Louise in his corner, prancing and rubbing his feet in the rosin. Max Schmelling standing calmly, getting last word from Doc Casey, and they're ready with the bell just about to ring. And there we are. And they got to the ring right together with Arthur Donovan, Skipper Brown, and Joe Louise is in the center of the ring. Max going around him. Joe Louise led quick with two straight lefts to the chin. Both of them light, but as the men clinch, Joe Louise tries to get over too hard left, and Max tries him up in the breakaway clean. On the far side of the ring now, Max with his back to the rope, and Louise hooks the left to Max's head quickly, and shoots over a hard right to Max's head. Louise, a left to Max's jaw, a right to his head. Max shoots a hard right to Louise. Louise with the old 1-2. The first to left.
Almost in the first 30 seconds, you can see the way it was going to go.
And watching for that chance, he is crowding, feeling.
You see his design is boring.
But his face is already marked.
Spider in the fly ain't got a chance.
He's landed more blows in this one round than he landed in only 5 rounds of the other fight. And there, Max Schmelling. And Max backed away. And missed the right. Louise then slapped him with 2 straight lefts to the face. And brought over that hard right to the head. High on the temple. And Max fighting up in a clinch and rope round. Is back against the ropes again there. Not too close to the ropes. Louise out. And Louise missed.
At just over a minute into the first round, Louise struck Schmelling with a ferocious blow to his side.
And Schmelling emitted a scream. I think everybody went, sort of like this. They had never heard a fighter scream in a high-pitched voice in agony.
Screams like a woman screams. The scream just went all through the stadium.
Again, a right to the body, a left hook, a right to the head, a left to the head, a right. Schmelling is going down. But he held to his feet, held to the look, looked to his corner in helplessness. And Schmelling is down. Schmelling is down. And he's up, and Louise, right and left to the head, a left to the jaw, a right to the head. And Donovan is watching carefully. Louise measured him, right to the body, a left up to the jaw, and Schmelling is down.
In a meaningless gesture, Schmelling's corner threw in the towel. Arthur Donovan threw it back, where it hung on the ropes as limp as the German himself, one writer put it.
The count is 5, 6, 7, 8. The men are in the ring. The fight is over on a technical knockout. Max Schmelling is beaten in 1 round, in less than a round.
Time!
It was 2 minutes and 4 seconds of murder, one writer marveled. The second shortest heavyweight title fight in history.
The winner and still champion, Joe Louise.
People are hugging each other, and black and white are embracing, women and men and strangers. And the scenes were wild. Jubilation and tears. People crying.
It was tremendous. It was almost as though we had defeated the Nazis there and then.
In Germany, millions had listened to the fight in growing disbelief.
8, 9, 10. Aus! Aus! Der Kampf ist aus! Schmelling ist K.O. Schmelling am Boden. Er kann sich nicht erheben. Angeguckt, das kann doch nicht sein. Das kann doch nicht sein. Die erste Runde war erst zur Hälfte um.
To suddenly hear on the air that the announcer, very confident, saying, Maxe tut das und Maxe tut das und jetzt kommt einen zurück und jetzt, Maxe macht da, Maxe, was macht? It was a sense of jubilation that we had, my father and I, and for the first time there was an inkling that Hitler might somehow be stopped.
In Harlem, news of the victory sent 100,000 people into the streets. This is their night, the police commissioner said, and closed off 30 blocks for the celebration.
I took the subway down to Harlem. The place was going wild. Little kids, they're dancing, and old, elderly people hobbling on canes, they're looking like, oh boy, good. It's the most wonderful thing that ever happened.
Every saloon in Harlem was packed to the rafters. People who'd never had a sip of beer in their lives were closing down the town.
Everybody was so elated by Louis winning and everything. I got just high, everything was spinning around. You thought I was in a fight. I went back to the bathroom and I'm walking on back there and walked right dead into the ladies' room. I walked right.
There never was a Harlem like the Harlem of last night. Take a dozen Christmases, a score of New Year's Eves, a bushel of July 4ths, and maybe, yes, maybe, you get a faint glimpse of the idea. The New York Daily News.
The celebration wasn't confined to Black America alone. For the first time, blacks and whites, even in the Deep South, had rooted with all their hearts for the same guy.
Right after Joe Louise's victory, we got to work ahead of time. And I will say this for this fellow where I worked. He says, well, looks like your man won. I said, he sure did, didn't he? He says, maybe that'll teach Hitler a lesson.
Joe had shattered the mask of the good Negro once and for all. All Americans loved him, not because he was docile and unassuming, but for the opposite reason. When they were at their weakest, he had reminded them of their strength.
I think the word is appreciation. They appreciated him, appreciated what he had done for them. Not only had he saved the honor of the country, but he gave them a tremendous moment of relief from this drudgery of pain that we were in the Depression. Man, it was tough. That night, everybody forgot the Depression. Everybody. My mother even gave me a nickel to go get an ice cream cone. That was unheard of, a nickel to celebrate, to go get an ice cream cone.
Going to take you over to Max Schmelling.
After the fight, Schmelling had been helped to his dressing room.
Max, will you say a word to the NBC audience? Just a word, please, Max. Ladies and gentlemen, I have not much to say. I'm very sorry, but I won't make any excuse, but I get such a terrible hit. The first hit I get in the left kidneys, I was so paralyzed I couldn't even move. And well, after it was all over, you know. Well, Max, I'm sorry. That's all I can say.
When Schmelling finally recovered enough to return to his native soil, there was no berth of honor on the Hindenburg, no Luftwaffe escorts, or personal meetings with Hitler.
They dropped him like a hot potato. Not even consoled or poor Max and so, no. They had lost every interest in him.
Schmelling's career was all but over. He fought a few more times, but never again in America. Freed from his entanglements with the Nazi government, Schmelling felt able to take risks he'd never been willing to take before. In November, during the national pogrom called Kristallnacht, he sheltered two small Jewish boys, the sons of an old friend, hiding them in his hotel room while Nazi gangs roamed outside.
And that man, known all over the world, did this for us is an unbelievable thing. This man has done for us what God didn't do. So how can you explain it better?
During the war, Schmelling was conscripted into the German army. After it was over, he was cleared by British authorities of any complicity in Nazi crimes. Schmelling rebuilt his life one more time. The Nazi idol earned a fortune as a bottler for the Coca-Cola Company in Germany.
He adapted in the Weimar period, he adapted in the Third Reich, and he adapted in 1945 and on. I mean, he rose again from the ashes.
Joe Louis went on to become the greatest heavyweight champion in history, defending his title 24 more times over the course of 12 years. His opponents were so overmatched, they earned the title Bum of the Month Club.
Joe Louis answers Uncle Sam's call to arms.
What's your name, Joe?
My name is Joe Louis Barrow.
Joe served his country honorably during World War II. His country didn't return the favor. He was relegated to a segregated unit and hounded for back taxes on money he had donated to the Army and Navy Relief Fund. To pay his debt, he fought on too long. His career finally ended for good in 1951 by a young Rocky Marciano, who wept in his dressing room after the fight. As the years went on, Louis's stature in Black America also suffered. New, more assertive black leaders were ashamed of what they regarded as Joe's accommodationism and were eager to dismiss him.
I wish he had been a vocal leader, but he did enough for me by stimulating hope and causing me as a boy to fantasize victories. And that despite everything, nobody is going to stop you from winning if you really set your mind to it. That was enough. I didn't need anything else from Joe Louis.
When Joe Louis knocked out Max Schmelling, he opened a door of history for every great black athlete in the coming generations who could be themselves, who did not have to mask their feelings, who did not have to hide their emotions, did not have to say yes, sir, and no, sir, to reporters.
Well, it took 3 years and 35 fights for you to get a crack at the world title, Joe.
Halfway through the broadcast of This Is Your Life in 1960, there was a surprise guest.
And the only one you lost?
I won that one on June 19, 1936, at Yankee Stadium in New York.
Yes, he's here, Joe, himself, a former world heavyweight champion from Hamburg, Germany, the black Ulan of the Rhine, Max Schmelling.
It had been more than 20 years since the two fighters had seen each other in the heat and chaos of Yankee Stadium, but it would mark another stage in their relationship. They would meet a dozen more times, always with a great show of warmth. Schmelling assisted Louis with money, and when Joe died in 1981, Max helped pay for the funeral. Much of the world came to believe Hitler's favorite boxer and America's great black hope had finally come to love each other.
We all love happy endings, and it's become convenient in a way to say that Joe Louis and Max Schmelling ended up as great friends. I don't think they were really great friends. I think they were barely friends. They barely knew one another. They'd spent only 40 minutes together in the ring, but history tied these two men together. History brought Joe Louis and Max Schmelling together, and in history they'll always be together.
Now in the center of the ring, they're measuring each other with left hands and doing little damage. So far, Schmelling has done as much leading with his left as Louis, although he hasn't landed.
Now let us talk about the brown bomber. Tell the nation this story. Let us talk about the brown bomber. Joe Louis was a fighting man. Well, let us talk about the brown bomber. Tell the nation this story. Let us talk about the brown bomber. Joe Louis was a fighting man. Well, now stop, let me tell you this story, and I hope you'll understand. I want to talk about a mighty great fighting man. He fought with the master's hands. He was born way down in the lowland in the state of ALA. He's a farmer boy, so I was told he had mother wit in his heart. Until one day he's thinking hard, thinking about the things involved. He packed his bag, kissed his mother in the door, and headed for old Detroit. And there he started.